Hello, everyone. Uh, Back here with you to study the Gospels. Last time we studied the Gospel of Matthew. I'm not necessarily studying them in any particular order. Um, we're going to look at the Gospel of John this time. A fascinating Gospel. One of my all-time favorites. Of course, usually the favorite book of the Bible is just the one I'm studying at the time. But John does have a very, very unique take on it, obviously separate from the synoptics, those very books that are similar to one another. But John does stand out as a very unique gospel for many reasons, and we're just going to talk about a few of those reasons right now. We're not going to, again, as I said before, dig into the many background details, rather, the dating of the book and authorship and so forth, but just some interpretive tools or thoughts for you to consider to begin your own journey in interpreting the book. Um, uh, a few things that I want to talk about with regard to some interpretive tools. Number one is how different John is compared to the other Gospels with regard to his dealings with miracles. The other Gospels contain many, many miracles that show and illustrate the power of Jesus and the identity of Jesus. John's Gospel actually highlights 7 miracles. The eighth, of course, the grand finale and the resurrection of Jesus, but other than the resurrection, 7 miracles, and some have suggested that that's the idea of completeness and so forth, and perhaps that's right, particularly since he's the author of the Book of Revelation, where that number seems to is used that way. But there are 7 grand miracles, and each one of those miracles sort of illustrates something unique about Jesus, his character or his power or his abilities and so forth. Um, the first one is obviously in John chapter 2, the miracle where Jesus turns water into wine. They're at a wedding feast, and with the encouragement of his mother, Jesus begins really his missionary journey, going toward the cross. And Jesus is reluctant, or seems reluctant at first, as he says, "What does this have to do with me and you?" And his mother then tells his servants to go and do what he says, and Jesus then does this wonderful miracle of turning water into wine. When I say reluctance, by the way, I see sort of a small little Garden of Gethsemane in John chapter 2. Remember, in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus cried, "Is there some other way that this could be done? Take this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done." So Jesus was always ready to do the will of God. But his humanity suffered, and his humanity was certainly reluctant. He didn't want to go to the cross. Um, but be that as it may, so here he is in the wedding, and he does this wonderful miracle. Well, what does this miracle tell us about Jesus? Which I think is one of the things that John is wanting to do with the miracles that he sort of hand selects out of all the miracles that could be done. Even he himself says so much could be written about what Jesus did and said. There's not enough space in the world that that would hold the amount of books that could be written about him. But first one, the changing of the water and the wine, according to Merle Tenney, who wrote a fantastic classic commentary, by the way, he says this really shows that Jesus has got over quality. The master of the feast in John chapter 2 and verse 10, for instance, drank some of the sample of Jesus's wine that he creates, and he says, "You've set out the best to last. This should have been first. It's not the custom." But what Jesus made was the best. It was the best quality. And what God does is always the best. And we can see that in sort of this. This is sort of a mini illustration of the new creation of Jesus. here, the new creation, going back and hearkening back to the creation of the world in Genesis 1 and 2, when what God created was very good. That's what I'm reminded of when I read this great miracle in John chapter 2, the good wine, the good creation that God initiates. So God is God over quality. The second one in John's Gospel that we see in John chapter 4 is the healing of the nobleman's son, where this nobleman comes to Jesus with a request to heal his son. And Jesus didn't have to go to his house to do this. He rebukes the faith of the crowd around him, the lack of faith, and he just says the word, and the nobleman's son is healed. He doesn't have to go to his home, doesn't have to go anywhere, and it's just a fascinating story. And the nobleman, believed the words of Jesus when he said it. He didn't need to see the son healed. He just needed to hear the words of Jesus spoken, and he believed. And it's very reminiscent of what Paul said, we walk by faith, not by sight. The kind of faith Jesus is looking for. Well, this miracle, according to Merle Tenney again, really illustrates that Jesus is God over space, that he doesn't have to physically go somewhere to get things done. Really fascinating take on that. Another miracle in John that really illustrates something unique about Jesus is the healing of the impotent man, the paralytic man in John chapter 5, where he's waiting for the stirring of the waters, and you can read that text yourself, and nobody's ever able to be there to help him into the water. Well, Jesus notices him and asks him if he wants to be healed, and the man, of course, does. And Jesus heals him instantly, tells him to take up his mat and go home. Of course, taking up his mat on the Sabbath meant work, according to the Pharisees, and gets Jesus in trouble. Jesus is okay with that because he sometimes is ready to pick a fight with some of these troublemakers to teach God's truth. But be that as it may, we definitely see Jesus as God over time. I say that because, and Merle Tenney says this because, Jesus didn't have to wait for the stirring of the waters for this man to be healed. He didn't have to help him in, and there's certain times where the bubbling of the waters and the tradition where angels came down and healed in the water. Well, Jesus didn't have to wait for anybody. He said the word, and he was healed. A very, again, powerful demonstration of who Jesus is. Then we see in John chapter 6 the feeding of the 5,000 with very, very little food, food that would never be able to feed 5,000, naturally speaking. But Jesus showing himself sort of as the new Moses, really the God who was over Moses in the wilderness. Here's this crowd, there's this thousands of people in this wilderness in the deserted area. And just like Israel in the Old Testament, who needed and depended upon God for the manna that came from heaven to survive, Jesus then works his miracle, and he takes what's so little, and he is allowed to create and again make food that would feed 5,000 plus people. And so really demonstrating that Jesus is God over quantity. He's over quantity, that he's not limited to quantity. No problems there. Of course, they want to take him as king, and immediately they want to force him to be king, and that wouldn't be a bad idea from their perspective, because if they want to take on the Romans, which is what many of the Jews wanted to do, what better king, what better ruler would you have than somebody who can do miracles like this? I mean, one of the things in the battlefield that soldiers worry about, generals worry about, is supply lines. You don't have to worry about that with somebody like Jesus. Wherever you are, he can just produce food, he can just produce water, and voila, he can heal people. So if somebody gets stabbed, he can just heal them and get them up, and you have a guaranteed victory. What a king that would be. Well, that wasn't the kind of king Jesus came to be, and they misunderstood that. But it does show that Jesus is God over quantity. The next miracle is the walking of the water on the water in chapter 6, verse 16 through 21. And very obviously, this shows that Jesus is God over natural law. And of course, all the miracles do this, but I suppose Merle Tenney had a hard time figuring out what else to say about this one. But he is God over natural law. That is true. Natural law being gravity, and Jesus was not limited to that. He did not sink, he walked on it. What a beautiful picture, again, who Jesus is. The sixth miracle that we see in John's Gospel is the healing of the blind man. In John chapter 9. And this miracle, of course, shows that Jesus is God over all misfortune. This guy was born blind. He, no doubt, in many prayers went up for him, and nothing until now. And so Jesus heals this man, and he's able to see. And Jesus is the one who gives sight, and he heals. And the seventh and sort of grand finale of the miracles of the Gospel of John, well, the real grand finale is what we might call the eighth one, the miracle, the resurrection of Jesus Christ himself would be the grand one, the eighth one, the one beyond perfection, right? But the seventh miracle is the raising of Lazarus in John chapter 11. And that, of course, obviously shows that Jesus is God over death. So there's the sort of summary of the miracles of the Gospel of John, and what I think John is doing in illustrating who Jesus is, identifying who his person is. Two quick unique features about the Gospel of John. One is where John's Gospel begins. Unlike Matthew and Luke, it begins with the birth narratives, the conception and birth. And unlike Mark, who is the speedy gospel, he's the gospel of action, right? We'll talk about that later, but he begins right with the ministries. But Matthew and Luke begins with the incarnation and birth narratives. John does something very different. He begins at the very beginning of the world, showing that Jesus transcends time, and he is in fact God. In fact, John's Gospel, most scholars agree, I think it's right, that John's Gospel was probably written later on in the first century a little bit. Some debate exactly when, but probably he's facing some controversy that's dealing with who Jesus is. Some are saying he's just man, not God, or just God and not man. Well, the first chapter takes care of this problem, saying that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. It's Genesis 1:1. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Well, the Word was God. He was in the beginning, and all things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made. Verse 3, 1, 2, and 3. So the Word is God, and yet, verse 14 of that same chapter says the Word is also flesh. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. So, verse 1, Jesus is God, the Word is God. Verse 14, he is man. So he's both man and God. And so sort of correcting some of the errors perhaps that John is having to face at this time. And the churches that he's writing to. That's very consistent with the epistles that John writes as well. I wish we had time to just talk about that word logos. What a rich word that was in ancient Greece. We have philosophers talking about this word. People like Heraclitus and others. Believed that the logos, the word, even though they had a very limited understanding of the nature of God, right? They definitely had a view of many of them. There was different views said about it, but everybody talked about the logos. But someone like Heraclitus, who said that the logos was sort of the glue that held the universe together. That without it there would be nothing but chaos. Everything was in flux. Everything was in motion. Nothing stayed the same, except one thing, and that was the Logos. The Logos sort of fought against the chaos, and we, without the Logos, everything in the world would only be chaos. Well, it isn't. We find organization, we find structure, we find harmony, we find reason and rationality, but we find all of this because of the Logos, according to many Greek philosophers. And then, of course, there's the Jews who had their idea of the Logos or the Word of God. The Logos of God was what created the universe. So here in one chapter, John brings everybody together. Uh, Whether you're Greek, whether you're Jew, he says this Logos, whatever your preconceived notions are about it, as rich as that might be, all of that funnels into one person, the one person who became flesh. And the incarnation is the answer. It's Jesus Christ. Is the one who brings order to chaos. He's the one who brings salvation to a lost world. He's the one who has created the world. He's the one who sustains it all by his power. Hebrews 1, verse 1 through 3. So, just a beautiful way of opening a very beautiful gospel on Jesus. So John just doesn't begin with a genealogy because he wants people to see right from the beginning that Jesus is someone um, with more than just a family genealogy. He is God. Certainly the other Gospels teach the same thing, but John just sort of puts a magnifying glass on it right from the get-go. The second quick thing is the personal interviews in John's Gospel. He really seems to focus on the individual. Again, not that the other Gospels don't do any of that, but there's a lot of the multitudes or the crowds or the preachings of Jesus. Whereas in John, you see the value of the individual. Whether we're talking about the conversation or interview with Nicodemus or the Samaritan woman, or we're talking about the woman caught in adultery, or Lazarus and Mary and Martha, that scene and episode. You really see this slower paced gospel just really focusing and honing in on individuals. And that I'm not saying you don't see crowds like the feeding of thousands, but it just seems to be a focus of John's gospel. Wish we had more time, but I hope that this kind of helps put some context in helping you to begin your journey in studying and interpreting John's Gospel. Appreciate your time, and we'll look forward to seeing you the next time.